Welcome back to Farms and Frontlines, everybody. I am your host, Max Terzano. I'm joined, as always, by Jess Rudo.
Hey there.
And today we've got a very, very special guest joining us, Dr. Chase Sova. Dr. Sova is the Senior Director of Public Policy and Research for the UN World Food Program US, as well as doing work for CSIS and the Council on Foreign Relations. So tons of free time for Dr. Sova, and we're very, very grateful that you're taking the time to come out and speak with us today. The reason we're having you here on the podcast is you published work for the World Food Program titled Dangerously Hungry. And in that project, you kind of take a very in-depth look at how food insecurity can lead to conflict. So we're really excited to talk to you a bit more about that. But Dr. Sova, we're super excited to have you here.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I think this is a really important topic and something I'm very excited to speak about. We've had Dangerously Hungry out now for, I think, a little over a year, this recent work, but the conversations around food-related instability seem to be still top of mind in sort of public sentiment right now, and also action at the Security Council and modern events, especially in conflict zones around the world. And so the timing of Dangerously Hungry, I think, was good, and it's led to a lot of follow-up conversations just like this one. So really pleased to be here and looking forward to dive in.
Let me say first, thank you for joining us. And everything we're talking about is just our own opinions, nothing reflective of our employers or anything else. When you think about food security, what is your definition of food security?
Well, I mean, there's fairly commonly well accepted definitions of food security coming out of the 1996 Food Summit in Rome, and I can't give you the exact definition, but here we're talking about access, availability, and highly nutritional foods or nutrient dense foods, or foods that meet the sort of minimum dietary requirements you need to live a happy and functioning life. And so that's what we're talking about at the highest levels. And the way we think about food security, there is that sort of technical definition, but beyond that, we tend to think about it in 3 or 4 pillars, right? And that when someone is food secure, they have an available food supply, meaning that this is really speaking about production. Is there enough calories in the system in which that person is living, and do they have access to those things, which is the second pillar. Access is a question predominantly of purchasing power. If there's market food available in markets, does someone have adequate resources to be able to purchase those things? And how many times is food simply out of reach because of its price, which is predominantly the major challenge today that we're facing. And then there's this question of nutrition and nutritional value, right? There's many billions of people around the world who are suffering from what we call hidden hunger. This is the incorrect mix of micro and macronutrients. People who might be consuming sufficient calories, but they're not getting the right sorts of micronutrients in particular. And so that's a big portion of this. And then there's this question of stability, right? Are all 3 of those conditions met over time without interruption? And so those 4 sort of pillars make up our common definition of food security.
Awesome. See, we did an episode a little while ago on like what is food security, and I think your response was more thorough than our whole 30 minutes, but we ended up getting sidetracked and talking about like the history of global organizations and all that. But
the one thing I might add here right now, because I think as we talk about food related instability, there are really 2 types of hunger that I tend to work with in my job. And, one of them is chronic hunger and the other is acute hunger. And so it is worth sort of differentiating for viewers that predominantly what we're going to be talking about today is acute hunger. And acute hunger is the type of hunger that's driven by a shock event in someone's life. When you hear the term, folks don't know where the next meal is going to come from. Typically, you're talking about acute hunger. Chronic hunger itself is something that's more systemic. Right. It's the result of poverty, marginalization, inequality, people who are consuming slightly less than they need day in and day out. They might be going to bed hungry, but there is no imminent threat to their life, at least in the short term, when we're talking about chronic hunger. So when we talk about the universe of hunger, in particular hunger in conflict environments, we're typically talking about acute hunger.
That's an excellent point to make. Yeah. No, we really appreciate that. And before we get into just diving into Dangerously Hungry, can you just kind of walk us through a little bit of what was the motivation behind writing and researching the project?
Yeah. Dangerously Hungry is really the second work in a two-part series. We wrote the first report on food-related instability back, must have been around 2015, and called Winning the Peace, Hunger and Instability. And Dangerously Hungry is really a follow-on to that conversation, diving into the research of the last 5 years since the production of that first report. But if we roll the clock back to 2015 to 2017, somewhere in that window, we were facing the four famines, if you recall. Famine was officially declared in four countries in 2017, and so there was, I think, a resurgence in people thinking about global food security. In particular, there was a resurgence of people thinking about food security as it resulted from conflict events around the world. The majority of the countries, if not all of them, who experienced the four famines were suffering, at least in part, by some internal conflict, war, social unrest. And so there was this natural linkage between conflict and food insecurity. In fact, if we go back in just about every major crisis in human history, when you have war and conflict, a natural outcome of that is poverty and hunger. So we sort of accepted hunger as a byproduct of war. And that just has rung true throughout history. In fact, as we look back to the Second World War, there have been some estimates that more than half of the number of people, some 20, 30 million people, died from starvation and starvation-related disease, more than those who died in active combat. And so there is this strong association between conflict and food insecurity. But there wasn't a lot of folks who were looking at that relationship in the inverse, the ways that food insecurity itself can be a destabilizing force. Now, I spend a lot of my time, I wear a couple different hats. One is with the World Food Program USA, where I spend a lot of time working with folks up on Capitol Hill, educating lawmakers on the mission of the World Food Program, the importance of international food assistance programs, etc. And then I wear a hat with CSIS and the Global Food and Water Security Program, where I can do a little bit more independent work, and I can take my WFP hat off and go a little bit further in some context. But anyway, during that time period, when I was going up to Capitol Hill and talking with lawmakers, I think that there was an anecdotal understanding of food-related instability. You talk to folks like Senator Lindsey Graham, who was on the State Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee, and he would say things like, feed them now or fight them later. And you had others, including Pat Roberts, who at the time was leading the Senate Agriculture Committee. And he would say things like, show me a nation that can't feed itself, and I'll show you a nation in chaos. And I think that there was an anecdotal understanding, at least among lawmakers, of the inverse relationship. But we really wanted to bring that from the realm of the anecdotal to the realm of the empirical. And that's what we tried to do with both the first study, Winning the Peace, and the second study, Dangerously Hungry, was to say, we know this is intuitively true, but what does the research tell us about food-related instability? So I think it was, a combination of just wanting to put some meat on the bones of this conversation. It was also, frankly, it was the start of the Trump administration. And was sort of beginning, there were questions about potential cuts to the foreign affairs programs, potential cuts to the international food assistance programs. And so I think that some of this was born out of an effort to sort of justify the value of these programs from a stability perspective and what this does, not just for soft power, but also for American security. When I go up and talk to lawmakers, there's typically three motivators that get people interested in international food assistance, right? It's either lawmakers are motivated because of the morality of it, right? It's something that we've done for a long time as a nation. It's something that represents what's best about the American people. Feeding someone who can't feed themselves or their families is morally right, and something that we've taken great pride in throughout the years, and pretty much throughout the existence of our country, we've taken that perspective. The other motivator has been economic, right? When you go up and talk to folks about the value of international food assistance programs, agricultural development programs around the world, to a certain extent, it is about opening up marketplaces for American products and consumers, and having trade partners who have a stable footing and can participate in the international marketplace. And so there was a lot of economic motivations. But as I mentioned from those anecdotes from lawmakers, there was increasingly this third leg of the justification stool, which is national security. And so I think that these two reports really round out and provide some evidence to that third pillar of why people care about these international food assistance programs.
Absolutely.
Isn't it fascinating? It's thinking about who your audience is and how you kind of shape not the narrative, but shape the problem and the problem set and how you get after it for those people that are in charge. That last part that you talked about, national security, we've talked on other episodes. Is it kind of like a blanket term? Does everything fall under national security? When you're thinking about food insecurity and national security, is everything national security in that sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, as you know very well, I mean, it is
Hmm.
possible to securitize things to the point that they, in sort of an improper way.
Yeah.
Not. I don't think that's what we're trying to do here with this work. I mean, when you think of international food assistance programs in particular, and the work of the United Nations World Food Program specifically, these organizations operate under very clear principles of international humanitarian law, right? They're impartial, they're objective, they're neutral. And so the risk with bringing food security into the national security conversation is always that organizations like the World Food Program, humanitarian organizations around the world, are perceived by third party actors as an extension of military power, of soft power.
Hmm.
And that's really not what we're trying to say here. It's really important that those international organizations maintain their neutrality and adhere to those international principles that underpin the humanitarian system. And so, yes, I do think that securitization of these topics has become more common. There is a risk to that. You really don't want humanitarian workers being targeted because they're
Yeah.
perceived an extension of any particular military around the world. That's not what they do, and that's a something that we need to protect at all costs. But at the
Hmm.
same time, I do think that third pillar of support, that national security pillar, was a little bit under leveraged. I would say. I mean, it was this relationship is so strong between food insecurity and instability that the risks to humanitarian principles in some ways I think needed to be also weighted against the value of having these conversations and the importance of having these conversations. So we're trying to do it in a thoughtful way. We're trying to do it in a way that is objective and empirical, in a way that keeps those humanitarian principles upheld, but simultaneously advancing a debate that I think is rather important. But yeah, I mean, everything is security these days. It feels like.
Yeah, but you make great points. So, thinking about that with food insecurity and stability, was your audience for dangerously hungry lawmakers, or was it a bigger scope than that?
I think that because of the hat that I wear specifically at the World Food Program
Uh
USA
huh.
and the work that we do up on Capitol Hill, that's always an audience that we're interested in.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, I think, consciously or subconsciously, that's probably the primary audience for a report like this. When we wrote the Winning the Peace report, Senator Todd Young, who at the time was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and was really drawn to this work and actually held a hearing on why food security matters. And we were able to testify on the Winning the Peace report there. And so there
Oh
was a
wow.
willing audience
Yeah.
and a sort of demand driven side to all of this. And you had critical champions up on Capitol Hill who wanted to have this conversation and were looking for the materials and experts to be able to draw into that conversation. And so to a certain extent, that was always going to be a key audience. But beyond that, it really is also about advancing the debate within thought leadership communities in Washington D.C. and beyond. And so that really, I'm looking at the think tank communities, the CSISs, the Wilson Centers, the Stimson Centers, the Brookings, and the whole pantheon of
Yeah.
think tanks that operate in that space who really help drive administration priorities. You have this, of course, revolving door between a lot of these think tanks and the administrations themselves.
Hmm.
And so that was also a key audience for this. We also found that there was a pretty significant appetite among universities just in general who are teaching professors and adjunct professors who are teaching global food security or national security courses or international relations courses who really found this to be a valuable resource in teaching and for students to really grasp this concept. So yeah, I mean, I think really it's Congress, it's the thought leadership and think tank community, and it's universities. We also found that, just generally speaking, everyday Americans who care about international affairs, who care about the work of the World Food Program, found this to be a pretty motivating topic, right? They wanted to learn more. So, I mean, I think to a certain extent that the interest was both from the layman side and from the public policy and policy making side.
Well, yeah. I mean, we've made a whole podcast about it. I mean, it's great.
Exactly.
And we like to think people listen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
me too.
it's quite a daunting topic. It's quite a task. Could you kind of walk us through some of the methodologies that you used or found helpful when you were creating this product?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's best to think of both Winning the Peace and Dangerously Hungry as a study of studies. And so really what we're looking at here is a systematic review of peer-reviewed academic literature, right? When we think of the way that the human understanding is advanced, some of that happens in what we call gray literature. So this is from folks who are writing things either from a practitioner perspective. What the World Bank, for example, produces is commonly referred to as gray literature, just because it's not. Sometimes it's peer reviewed, other times it's not, but it doesn't go through the formal journal cycle that academic work does. And then the other side is the peer reviewed side, and we're really focusing on that side in the Dangerously Hungry and the Peace
That makes
side.
sense.
So
yeah.
These are the sorts of things that you're going to find in academic databases. University students, when they sign into their accounts and they get drawn into the Web of Science and Scopus and all of these sort of centralized databases for where they find academic literature. That's what we're focusing on in the piece. So it is, to a certain extent, the highest caliber of work and research that falls within that space. It is vetted, it is run through the peer-reviewed cycle, and that's really what we're focusing on. So what we do in both the production of these reports is go in with keywords into those academic databases. It's things like food insecurity, instability, food insecurity, war, using that sort of Boolean logic to pull out results from those data sets, and then meticulously going through those records one by one to identify studies that really speak to precisely what we're looking for, which is the ways that food insecurity itself is driving instability. And so what we did with each one of those was do a preliminary screening of all of the results. When we did this in 2015, the keywords that we put into those data sets kicked out about 3,500 or 4,000 results. Jeez. When we revisited this work in 2020, when we did this in 2023 and 2024 for Dangerously Hungry, those same results over just a 5-year period produced about 8,000 returns. And so you can see the sort of growth in the literature on food security and instability happening simply in the way that the academic data sets are kicking back results. So what we do is with each one of those studies, then, you sort of narrow it down. This is meticulous, backbreaking work because it's very slow and you're going through all of this literature to see what's actually speaking to the theme you're interested in. And then, you'll get things that come back like, a 2.5 standard deviation increase or decrease in rainfall results in, a 5 to 10% increase in the likelihood of civil war. You get sort of really technical jargon that comes out of these things. And so what we did was for each of the top tier studies that came out of these academic searches, we would provide some sort of coding to that and say, okay, well, if this study, when was it produced? What was the geographic focus? What was the primary driver of food insecurity in that case? And then what sort of instability were the researchers testing? So you're sort of looking and identifying the dependent and independent variables. And then you do that over and over again for the sort of 60 studies that are in Dangerously Hungry. And then with that framework, you're able to tell, a more accessible story for folks. And that's what Dangerously Hungry does. So study of studies, systematic review, and then that allows us to create a framework to help guide the reader through this kind of messy body of literature.
Oh,
that's incredible, though. Yeah.
Honestly, it is. It's. I mean, just the task of looking at 8,000 studies and combing through that, like these are the 60 we want to pull information from. That alone is just daunting as all get out. So props to you and your team for going through all that to put together the report. It's truly impressive.
I think it also has to be inspiring because the amount of research that's being done on a topic that you're passionate about more than doubled. So that must have been exciting also to be like, yes, people are thinking and talking about this. Thank you.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
and I think there was a reason for that. Back in when we wrote the Winning the Peace report back in 2017,
Yeah.
we were talking around the four famines. We had at that point, maybe 150 or 160 million people in crisis levels of hunger. You remember that distinction between acute and chronic hunger we talked about at the top, but most
Mhm.
people were falling into that acute category.
Wow.
So there was a growing understanding that conflict, and this is still very much true today, that conflict, man-made conflict in particular, is the single largest driver of hunger around the world. Now there are other drivers, climate-related extreme events, economic challenges in countries around the world, particularly in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Mhm.
These are other major drivers of the acute hunger problem, which has now
Mhm.
ballooned to over 300 million people today.
Yeah.
But the understanding of conflict and its relationship to food insecurity has really, really grown over the past 5 years. Now, when this sort of was kicked off with the awarding of the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize to the World Food Program, right? And that was a sort of watershed moment to a certain extent because it was a recognition formally of the ways that food insecurity itself is creating instability, but also the peace dividends
Mhm.
that are produced from providing assistance to people who can't feed themselves and their families. And so there was a little bit of growth in public sentiment around the food and conflict relationship that was born out of that Nobel Peace Prize awarding. But there was also some things that happened at the Security Council dating back to 2018, where you had, for the first time, the United Nations Security Council, with Resolution 2417,
Mhm.
officially condemning the use of food as a weapon of war in
Right.
conflicts.
Mhm.
And we can maybe talk about this near the end of the conversations. We talk about international humanitarian law. But
Perfect.
suffice to say, UN Security Council Resolution 2417, two separate resolutions in both the House and the Senate, the United States, that were reiterating the outcomes of 2417 and also condemning the use of food as a weapon of war, the Nobel Peace Prize, and then also, the events of 2020 and the COVID pandemic and it's the surge in hunger numbers around the world, acute hunger in particular, I think caused more and more people to be thinking about this relationship. And so I don't think it was an accident that
Yeah.
Mhm.
this body of literature was growing. It was just really high on people's minds and research. I think research can take a while to catch up to where public sentiment is and understanding is. And so when we did our first snapshot back in 2015, really the only thing that we were working off of as it relates to food related instability was the 2007 2008 global food price crisis. And so
Mhm.
in that period, you had major rise in social unrest associated with food costs. And so a lot of what's captured in the first report, Winning the Peace, is a reflection of sort of that time period that had happened almost a decade prior, where 40 countries were experiencing civil unrest, at least one government was toppled, all of this
Yeah.
on the backs of rising food prices. And so yeah, I mean, I think it wasn't an accident. There's been a lot of interest in this topic over the last 5 years.
I just think it's great. It's good. It's so important. It's
Yeah,
2008 when the Egyptian the bread helmet was at the 2008 food crisis.
would have been 2011
11.
probably.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
you had two waves of food
Yep.
price crises, right? 2007, 2008. A lot of that was driven by climate related extreme events and shocks in Eurasia and Russia and other places that coincided simultaneously with climate events that reduced production in the United States, and then a simultaneous rise in fuel prices around the world. So that was 2007, 2008. Those prices remained high. The
Yeah.
average basket of food for the average person around the planet remained high through 2011. And there is a pretty significant body of literature linking food price increases to the events of the Arab Spring. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I think all of that sort of falls on. I almost consider that a one, 3 and 5 year event as opposed to two separate episodes.
Right.
Yeah.
But most of that is a result of that first shock to the system in 2007, 2008.
Right. You mentioned already some of the drivers of food-related instability, being climate crisis, these economic shocks. In Dangerously Hungry, you also mentioned resource conflict, which is pretty self-explanatory.
Yep.
Another thing that you talked about that I'd like to just dig into for just a couple minutes, if you don't mind. In Dangerously Hungry, you point out three motivators of food-related instability as well. Do you want to just dig into that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about food related instability, or at least the way that I think about it, is that you really, for instability to occur, there needs to be some sort of combination of drivers and individual motivators. And we did talk about some of the drivers that are captured in the literature here. And so, that's a result of that coding process, going through those work one by one and saying, well, what is the driver here? In some cases, it might be a change in rainfall, might be temperature variability, um, it could be flooding events, climate related extreme events, tropical storms, these sorts of things. So that might be a
Mhm.
variable that a researcher is testing and then linking to agricultural production and then later to some sort of instability. So that all falls within the climate bucket. The resource competition, as you mentioned, of course, is about more permanent resources. So here we're talking about land and permanent water resources. We can dive maybe a little bit deeper into that, but this is predominantly the sort of premier example of this is conflict between pastoralists and agricultural communities in the African
Mm.
Sahel, where you have a strong desertification happening as the Sahara Desert creeps south by about a mile each year,
Mm.
pushing pastoralists into conflict with agriculturalists who are on fixed properties and land,
Right.
and so that leads to conflict in and of itself. And then you have the economic shock piece, which I think is again, we talked through a little bit the food price crisis of 2007, 2008. What happens when people can't afford food, even when it's available on shelves? Well, it's generally protest and riot.
Right.
So those are the drivers. On the individual motivator side, though, it's important to remember that food insecurity itself is almost never the sole cause of instability, right?
Right.
You can
Yep.
have a shock to someone's life, you can reduce their access to food, but without some sort of underpinning motivation, it's very unlikely that that metastasizes into anything beyond people suffering in silence. And
Right.
so the individual motivators is a good way to think about the underlying conditions that are already present in a country when a food shock occurs. And we generally drop those into three buckets. This report is a really good rule of three report, right? We've got three drivers and three motivators. The
Yeah.
motivators themselves, the first one is desperation, right? Sort of the underlying principle here is that of opportunity cost, right? So when someone is, let's say, affected by a food shock, they either there's a loss in agricultural availability, they can't afford food, whatever, they can't feed themselves or their family. The opportunity cost theory suggests that if someone comes in and offers you something greater than the status quo, then you're very likely to take that resource, even if it's not in your best interest. And so the desperation thing here is really about exploitation. It commonly manifests in ways that non-state actor groups, in particular, go in, offer something small to people who can't feed themselves or their
Yep.
families in order to draw them into their movements. And so you see this with Boko Haram, you see this with Al Shabaab, you see this
Yes,
with
sir.
ISIS. So these sort of opportunity cost things, these deal with this underlying desperation that is very exploitable by people. So, and it can cause people to join a movement that they don't necessarily believe in because you do that out of desperation of wanting to feed your children.
Exactly.
Yep.
So that's a really important individual motivator. The other is the grievance motivator. The grievance motivator sort of suggests that societies themselves are, these sort of complex social fabrics, but there's also very exploitable schisms in society, and that food insecurity can be the straw that breaks the camel's back to cause these existing grievances to boil over. Sometimes that happens between ethnic communities. Sometimes it happens in sort of a collective coalescing force, in the sense of, let's say that you are in a country in the Middle East and there's suddenly a shock to the price of bread and wheat. In those particular cases, the grievance motivator can cause groups to come together, particularly in urban areas, when you have products of cultural significance, food products of cultural significance that see major increases in prices. So that can be something that crosses class. It can be something that crosses, wealth, ethnicity, whatever causes people to riot simultaneously. So the grievance motivator kind of works in two ways. When you get a food shock, it can cause existing conflicts to bubble up, or it can cause this sort of collective action across class, ethnicity, whatever, and manifest in the form of protests and riots. So that's the grievance motivator. The other thing I would say about that is that, despite all of this effort to link food insecurity to instability, the single greatest driver or indicator of conflict is a history of it in a country. And so if you have social unrest in a particular place, food insecurity, and a shock to food prices and availability can simply cause that to resurface. And so, it's important not to put too much causation on the question of food related instability. Sometimes we just like to think of this as a threat multiplier, in at least in the grievance motivator. The other final bit of this is governance, right? In so many places around the world, there are just, in the United States, for example, if you were to find yourself in a difficult situation where you are experiencing severe food insecurity, there are social safety nets that can help lift you and prevent you from hitting rock bottom. And that might be things like the SNAP or the WIC program, our food stamps programs. That provide a safety net. But around the world, in developing countries and places where organizations like the World Food Program are predominantly working, there are very limited capacity within governments to be able to provide that safety net to people, and social protection systems are just not functioning in the way they are in advanced economies.
Yeah.
And so the governance motivator is important because it is a reflection of trust in government. When a crisis occurs, is government able to provide a backstop for people? Are they able to provide critical resources to people? Can they scale up existing interventions that they have in place to be able to reach new hungry populations? And if they can't, what does that do for people's trust in government? On the same side of things, this is where the exploitation and the desperation motivator come in. When you have organizations that are operating far from the reaches of the state, and this is very true for sub-Saharan Africa, where you typically have, one really heavily populated capital, but then large swaths of relatively unpoliced territory in these places. Groups like non-state actors and Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, ISIS, the work, they will try to set up parallel social distribution and social protection systems, providing food to people and claiming that they can do it better than the state. Then simultaneously, there's this question of justice. If there is inadequate policing in an area, and you can look to some other entity to provide you with a sense of justice and retribution for a wrong that's been done to you, that's something also that these extremist organizations in particular are good at exploiting. So all of that sort of falls into the governance motivator. So the bottom line in all of this is that food-related instability is not something that results, out of thin air when suddenly when there's not enough calories in the system or food is too pricey. There have to be these underlying motivators that are pre-existing that allow food crisis to metastasize into conflict.
It's amazing.
I really like that everything you said there. It makes me kind of think of everything that we've talked about in previous episodes. Kind of puts it all through a different lens for us, where like we talked about Mexican drug cartels and kind of how they gained prominence and how there were like these under-policed areas, and they were able to come in and kind of help people out at first and be like these community groups that eventually evolved into what we know today as the cartels or international criminal organizations or whatever you call them. So kind of just putting down an outline for how that happens, what to look for and how to be aware of it, lets you think about it all through a different lens. I think it's just very interesting.
That's an important point, Max. And the thing is, very often you start out with, in certain communities, with non-state actor groups, very often they start out cooperating with communities, right? Providing protection, providing resources. But what happens over time, this whole quip that an army marches on its stomach, this sort of Napoleon.
I wrote that down. I was going to ask.
Yeah, that's an important. It's an important element of this,
Yep.
right? Because at some point, as a extremist organization or a non-state actor group gains prominence and gains strength and size, at some point there need to be resources to be able to fuel that rebellion. And so, what you'll have is people turning those groups turning on communities that they originally intended or signaled protection for,
Right.
and able to be able to make a grab at those resources either for their export earnings in the case of cash crops, or
Hmm.
simply just the theft of those resources in order to divert them to fighting, and that's something that happens over and over again. But that's I think an important element of this, right? It's like, you've got this conversation that starts with cooperation that turns into something else entirely over time.
Right.
Yeah, even that avocado example, it's right. There were those local neighborhood sources, and they end up transitioning into new cartels.
Los Viagras.
Yeah, Los Viagras. Yep.
Hmm.
Thinking about everything that you just explained to us and how it's kind of this cyclical type of relationship or crisis, if you will. You have these things that are drivers. You have the economic shock, climate crisis, resource conflicts that feed into, these other motivators like desperation and grievance and governance. Is there a recommendation or is there a way to look at it? Like, how do we break those cycles? Or is there something to put resources towards to help in these food related instability relationships, this circular kind of craziness that's happening? If somebody could focus on one thing, like, is it governance to like create security, to get rid of grievances? Is that a way to look at this problem set?
Well, I mean, certainly you've got a fundamental problem with the capacity of governments around the world to be able to provide
Yeah.
services to their people. I was at a session at the World Bank, a couple of years ago, and I listened. It might have been a leader from Somalia talking about, the best way to protect against fragility is to have governments who want to provide services to their people. So there is, to a certain extent, this question of governance, but that's a really difficult one to handle, right? That gets
Yeah.
us into conversations around nation building and state building, and those things carry quite a price tag. Plus, it's necessarily a conversation about impeding on the sovereignty of nations by
Yeah.
external actors to try to build societies in someone else's image, and so that can be dangerous
Yeah.
territory, I would say. It's not that donors and international development organizations don't try to tackle the problem of governance. I mean, there are countless entities who are working at improving the quality and capacity of government, just as there are organizations in the United States trying to make government work more effectively and efficiently. So that I think is a consummate problem, and one that isn't going away. But the development organizations do spend a fair amount of time on that. I think the bigger question here is, are we actually matching the scale of the problem with sufficient resources when it comes to food security specifically?
Yeah.
And I think it's a resounding no on that front, right? The World Food Program has
Yeah.
a $20 billion, this particular year has a $20 billion operating budget, and will probably receive between $8 and $9 billion in funding from donor governments around the world. And so, when you're constantly operating at 50% of your operational capacity, it means that there's just a lot of people falling through the cracks. And so you can ask a question, and I think a reasonable one, about whether the United States and other major donors are actually up to the task of providing sufficient resources commensurate with the problem. And are we an order of magnitude off in how much we're providing to these international development programs and international food assistance programs specifically? Because we know that when we provide assistance in conflict events around the world, there are these important peace dividends that result from that, right? When you provide assistance to communities, it can build social cohesion, it can build trust
Mhm.
in government and
Hmm.
international organizations. I mean, there are these really good positive benefits, and it can also help to dismantle that calculus that someone has when they're about to be exploited, by an extremist organization who are
Right.
offering them something. So if you're offering nothing, then that's a rather easy choice. But
Right.
you can change the equation in calculus for someone if you're thoughtful about it. And so I don't think we're doing enough I think we can do more on the governance side. We can be doing more on the long-term agricultural development side to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where we're just required to provide assistance year in and year out.
Right.
One thing that's always stuck with me, the former executive director of the World Food Program, Bertram Cousin, said at a board meeting, years ago now, but she said, we cannot afford to save the same life twice. And that's absolutely true in the international humanitarian space. Given the resourcing challenges that we're having, it used to be that you come into a crisis as a humanitarian organization and, your work was a sprint, set up supply chains, provide assistance for people, and get out of the way once that's done. But increasingly, as you're working in conflict events, organizations like the World Food Program are increasingly dug in for the long haul, right? Because there are no alternatives. And it means that we have operations that are 40 and 50 years old, right?
Wow.
In countries around the world that have been in and out of crisis and that just require constant maintenance from international humanitarian organizations like the World Food Program. So, yeah, I think obviously if I put the World Food Program hat on, I want to go up to Congress and say we're not doing enough in these particular accounts, right? The commodity accounts, we're providing American grown food and putting it on ships and sending it abroad. And we're not doing enough in the accounts where we're providing cash for organizations like the World Food Program to procure food off of international markets and move it from where it is to where it needs to be. And so there is no silver bullet in all of this. But if we're not even meeting our sort of basic needs when it comes to humanitarian food assistance accounts, we can never hope to solve the problem of those longer term development challenges. So we've got to balance getting those short term, stop the bleeding stuff done, so that we can actually spend time and resources on those longer term questions that we're talking about on good governance, service provision, and agricultural development.
Absolutely. And like you said, like the operating budget for this year is like 20 billion or 8 to 9 billion. But and that sounds like a lot, but when you break it down and you're trying to feed hundreds of millions of people in countries literally all over the globe, you can blow through that pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, if you look at the foreign affairs spending in the United States, just in general, the United States government has a $5 trillion budget that we spend through every year, right? We don't always raise that sort of money. We're always operating on a deficit, and increasingly a pretty large one. We're $1 trillion short in what we're bringing in and what we're spending. But of that, about more than half of that is locked up. Some $3.5 billion is locked up in entitlement programs in the United States, meaning that if you're entitled to the program, you're going to get a payout no matter what. So these are your Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all this sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What's left over that we fight over every year is the so-called discretionary budget, and that's only about $1.5 trillion, right? And half of that immediately is going to the military, so $800 billion. The other $800 billion is what we argue over. We talk about government shutdowns. If we can't find agreement on this is when we run into those shutdowns and these continuing resolutions, etc. But the whole point of me saying this is that, I think the American people have a perception that we're spending a huge amount of money on international assistance programs and development and humanitarian assistance programs. When you ask somebody, they'll say, something like 20% of the U.S. budget goes to foreign issues. But it's a much, much smaller number than that. In fact, it's less than 1% of the entire $5 trillion in spending that ends up off of American shores. Yeah. And then of that, something like 0.07% ends up in international food assistance accounts. And so, there's a real resourcing challenge. And I think that, it's a really difficult balance because, on its whole, we have a lot to be grateful for in the United States in the sense that our government is providing more assistance to the World Food Program than any other donor nation around the world. Right. Now, is that commensurate with the size of our economy necessarily? I don't know. There's probably some donors out there, Scandinavian countries in particular, who are giving a larger percent of their GDP to organizations like the World Food Program than the United States is. But in outright real dollars, the United States is the single largest provider. But at the same time, can we be doing more? I think we've got to ask ourselves tough questions about that.
Right. Well, we're glad to be having folks like you looking into that and asking those questions.
Yeah.
So just moving forward, we wanted to talk about just for a few minutes, kind of getting into the kind of latter portion of Dangerously Hungry, where you talk about emerging themes in food insecurity and things that you're looking towards the future. I figured we could spend a few minutes just talking about urban hunger and then from there transition into food as a weapon of war.
Yeah, we can do this pretty quickly on the urban hunger front. The bottom line is that when we look at the food-related instability landscape and we talk about those three drivers, economic shocks is one of the most well researched. And I talked about the what we called the silent tsunami back in 2007 and 2008, with those 40 different countries experiencing food-related instability and social unrest. We had a very similar instance happen in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where global food prices spiked once more. Import dependent nations, particularly in North Africa, were really affected by the grain that was locked up in Ukraine during that period of time.
Yep.
And so we saw another spike in food related instability and social unrest. We saw government fall in Sri Lanka in that time period, a combination of an increase in food prices, fuel prices, and sort of poorly planned out fertilizer policies in the country. So that was a combination shock that affected Sri Lanka. But all of this to say that the food price crisis and high food prices and that economic shocks driver is a really critical one. And when we look at where we are right now, it's really top of mind. But it's also that this food price crisis tends to take place predominantly in urban areas, right? Where you have in rural areas these unpoliced states, these unpoliced regions, more likelihood of higher levels and higher orders of conflict and insecurity. What happens in urban areas is you have a lot of really well connected people able to mobilize quickly to be able to come to the streets and protest food and fuel prices. And so the urbanization component of this matters quite a lot, in the sense that as the world continues to urbanize as it is, and the trajectory is obvious to anybody who looks at it, the likelihood of food price crises turning into social unrest, in particular in urban settings, is there's very high risk of that going forward. The more people that you have living in places not producing their own food and living in countries that are dependent upon imports, which is where you have a lot of this food price crises happening in urban settings, the likelihood of that particular brand of food-related instability growing with time, I think, is pretty obvious. And so we need to be spending a little bit more time thinking about that. So that's the urbanization piece. If you go into the report, you can find the specifics on the speed at which the world is urbanizing, the specific risks for food price shocks and the resulting instability and social unrest from that. But I think that's an important piece to note.
Absolutely. We talked a lot about that. Well, not a lot, but we touched on it with Zane Swanson when he was on the episode last time we had one out. So definitely interesting to see how it all ties together.
Yeah, and you see a lot of this as well with COVID-19 pandemic. What was novel about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it forced a lot of people into severe hunger for the first time, predominantly because of food price increases. And a lot of this was happening in lower and middle income countries,
Right.
People living in urban areas in particular. So urban hunger has been growing over the last couple of years as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also just exacerbated by natural trends and increased urbanization over time, and fewer people producing food in a subsistence manner and migrating to cities for more and greater opportunity. And so you're going to see this play out over and over again, but it was really sped up by the COVID-19 pandemic for sure.
Right. The final thing that we really wanted to talk to you about, and something that Jess and I are both really fascinated with and just keep coming back to in pretty much every conversation we have, is food being used as a weapon of war. And I know at the top of the episode you talked about the UN resolution, followed by bills that passed the House and Senate to kind of cover this topic. But I'd love to hear more from you about the subject.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important one, and I think of a sort of natural continuation of the work of the Winning the Peace Report and the Dangerously Hungry Report. It sort of begs the question. Food-related instability is something that's obviously happening around the planet, and it's driven by these factors and individual motivators. But the obvious next question is to what extent our organizations, states, etc., around the world not making good on their international humanitarian law, requirements to be providing assistance to people in times of conflict, or trying to prevent civilian starvation when when fighting. And so these things I think are married in a unique way, and it's sort of a natural continuation of the Winning the Peace report. It's something I think I'll be spending a little bit more time thinking about going forward. But I mean, there are the bottom line is this: there are very clear civilian protections built into international humanitarian law. All this dates back to the Geneva Conventions, first in the aftermath of the Second World War, but then the additional protocols that were added in 1977. Those additional protocols talked about things like proportionality. They talked about the importance of properly targeting enemies as opposed to this indiscriminate attacks between civilians and combatants. And so the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols provide us the legal basis for prosecuting starvation crimes today. Now, the other piece here are the Rome statutes that were taken up in the late 1990s with the establishment of the International Criminal Court. And this creates the mechanism to try individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so the Rome statutes draw on that existing legal framework drawn out in international humanitarian law from the Geneva Conventions and so on. There are very clear restrictions in both the Rome statutes and the Geneva Conventions on starvation crimes. It's pretty well outlined. There are, I would say that the Security Council Resolution 2417 reiterates both of those legal frameworks, but it does very little to clarify international humanitarian law. The problem has been over time that there are still some that believe that international humanitarian law is just not clear enough in the case of starvation crimes. Because it's quite complicated, right? And imagine siege tactics and blockades that are designed to target combatants predominantly, but civilians are caught up in the fallout of that. And so you really have to look deep into the legal text of the additional protocols to determine whether those acts themselves would qualify as starvation crimes. And it gets complicated because obviously there's a lot of dual use infrastructure out there, right? Like grain elevators that are providing food to both combatants and civilians alike. And so the bottom line is we've had a really hard time litigating the problem of starvation around the planet simply because there's a lot of room for interpretation in international humanitarian law. And it's also very difficult to prove intent, right? They have this, the term, the guilty hand and the guilty mind, and both of those two things need to coincide for someone to be tried for the crime of starvation. And it's very difficult to identify someone's, mental state. And recklessness doesn't seem to be, sufficient to try starvation crimes in the ICC, right? It has to be a premeditated violation of someone's, right to food. And so it's just proven very complicated. There have been some advancements there. As I said, 2417 creates, does little to clarify international law, and it reiterates it. But there are some mechanisms that were built into 2417 that allow the Security Council to receive complaints on starvation crimes and violations of when humanitarian assistance is unlawfully impeded, resulting in widespread starvation. So there is a little bit of meat to 2417, but for the most part, it's a rather timid resolution, I would say, that doesn't really advance our understanding of international humanitarian law, but was a really important political, I think, milestone. And the reason is the United Nations Security Council typically deals in individual events, right? In particular conflicts. They very rarely take on thematic topics like starvation crimes and food-related instability and food in conflict, right? And the reason is that can be perceived as, too broad of a paintbrush, right? It would be intervening on state sovereignty, where the likelihood of intervening on state sovereignty would be too great if you take on thematic topics. So it is evidence that, the passage of 2417 in particular is evidence of, the political value at which nations around the world are holding this question of conflict and food security, and is an important political and symbolic moment. Of course, that was reiterated by both the House and Senate, again, not bringing a lot of resources to bear or clarifying international humanitarian law, but elevating it in the American consciousness. And so I think that was important as well. But the bottom line is we're not a whole lot closer to actually being able to try starvation crimes, International Criminal Court. So I think that's pretty high level, but maybe gives you the contours of the complexity of this debate.
Can I
Yeah,
ask a
absolutely.
follow on question for that? If
Yeah.
you're thinking about food as a weapon of war, would the inverse be the same, food as a diplomatic leverage tool? Should that also be considered when you're thinking about weapons of war?
You're talking about like a country withholding food as a for diplomatic advantage.
The other side of that is, if you come to the table, we can help provide whatever foodstuffs. You know what I
Oh,
mean?
I see
Like,
what you're saying. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I see.
yeah.
Well, to
I
a
mean,
certain extent, you see that in something like the Black Sea Grain Initiative that happened
right.
Right. Yep.
with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Right, that was a third-party UN brokered
Yep.
deal to be able to move food in and out of the Odessa port on the Black Sea. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that was a valuable negotiating tool to try to to bring two parties to the table. I think that's probably one of the premier examples of that, in fact. But that lasted for about a year and a half
Yeah,
Yep.
before it
yeah.
fell apart, and now Ukraine is having to manage its own transportation networks on the west side of the Black
Yeah.
Sea in order to continue to move that, and it's really dependent on the Ukrainian Navy to be able to maintain those
Yeah.
access points. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful, but solving the food problem doesn't solve the broader problem of conflict. And at the end of the day, you need a lot more resources brought to bear on ceasefires, negotiations that happen predominantly in diplomatic circles. But yeah, no, I think it's a well taken point.
It made me think of, again, that Black Sea Grain Initiative where Russia is using food as hoping to have that leverage to get more out of the deal than they were, and with the threat of, stopping food from leaving.
Right.
But I wonder too, should that be part of the conversation where, this is not how we should handle this? You know what I mean?
Right.
You
Yeah.
Right.
shouldn't have,
Right.
yeah,
Well,
shouldn't
it's
have.
not just that. I mean, Russia also had, as soon as the invasion happened, of course, there was, sanctions that were imposed against Russia.
Yeah,
But,
yeah, yeah,
there were very clear carve outs within those sanctioned regimes that allowed Russia to continue to export fertilizer and food
yep,
simultaneously. So there were still export earnings coming into Russia because of the importance of protecting a really integrated global food system that relies on all actors, whether they're behaving in good faith or not,
yeah,
to continue to
yeah,
move food. And so one of the things that we think about a lot is that, with food price crises in particular, you've got this global food system that is this really complex web of movements of
mm,
food, traditionally on bulk carriers moving, across oceans to major ports around the world. But what happens is when you have food price increases and food price spikes and shocks to the system, as you saw in 2007, 2008, and then also with the COVID-19 pandemic, the risk of countries coming in and putting in export restrictions is quite high. And so, I've heard it likened to, folks at a football game when the row in front of you stands up, you have no other option but to stand up as well, or you miss the
mm,
game. And
Right.
so, in that particular case, these export restrictions can really snowball, right? It
yeah,
starts off with, maybe Indonesia restricting rice exports and India trying to keep, the same for rice or wheat to protect their own domestic populations. But at the
right,
same time, the world is so dependent upon well functioning international food trade system that this protectionist behavior can have pretty terrible consequences for the price of food. So that's what you see in Russia as well, right? I mean,
yeah.
it's just there was too much risk associated with sanctioning Russia and also restricting the move of fertilizer and food out of that country. So yeah, I mean it is a critical piece of negotiating in any conflict to be able to keep food moving, despite all of these protectionist instincts that so many countries have.
That's
Well,
fascinating.
Yeah,
it really
yeah,
is. I think that's something that we always, after like every episode we do, we come back. We're like, oh, this reminds me of that episode we did, or
It's
this
just
ties
all
into that,
connected. Yeah,
and it
yeah.
really is all connected. But to kind of finish up, Dr. Silva, I know Jess and I could probably sit here and listen to you talk about food security all day, but we know you're a
Okay.
busy man, so we'll come to an end here. We'll finish up and let you go. But again, I just want to
We're like
thank
we're
you
holding them
for.
hostage.
I know, right?
it doesn't feel like that.
Is there anything else you wanted to just cover up real quick before we're done here? Yeah.
Check out the Dangerously Hungry report if you haven't already. I think it's worth looking into. I think a lot of conversations still to come on these topics, including this question of international humanitarian law and starvation
Hmm.
crimes and food as a weapon. Some events happening right now at the International Criminal support in the Gaza context, which I think are going to be
Yep.
case studies in this going forward.
Absolutely.
So keep your eyes and ears on the news. I think you're going to see conversations around food-related instability continue to be prevalent, especially as we sort of enter in this new era around the world of new great power competition and a sort of reorientation of and a questioning of the sort of post World War II rules based order. Like all of this is under threat at the moment, and the only thing I know for certain, we haven't defined what that era is going to be. Whether it's a new multipolar world of conflict, we haven't defined it yet, and international relations scholars will do that. But the bottom line is that in a world in transition, the only thing that is almost guaranteed is an increase in food insecurity as the societies continue to transform. So we have to keep our eye on the ball in the next coming decades here to prevent what are already historical highs in acute and chronic hunger from getting even worse.
Absolutely. And
Man.
we're trying to do our part. We have a very brand new Farms and Frontlines newsletter that we will start with you. Throw a link to Dangerously Hungry in there as well.
That'd be great.
So anybody who wants to read it will be able to find it in there. And we'll also put the link up on the description of this episode when it goes up. Definitely encourage anybody who's enjoyed this conversation to go in there and read it. A lot of excellent work and just a very important piece of literature. So, Dr. Sova, thank you again so much for taking the time,
Really
3 different
appreciate
times, to come speak with us.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, and always a pleasure to chat with you.
Absolutely. We hope to have you back.
Do what you guys are doing and getting the words out.
We try.
Thank you.
All right, chat soon.
All right,
bye-bye.
thanks again.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Farms and Frontlines. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Sova. I think it was very enlightening.
Super enlightening.
If you don't already, please follow us on our socials. We're at Farms and Frontlines. We also are very excited about our previously mentioned newsletter. It will be coming out bi-weekly, so the way it'll work is you'll get an episode one weekend, a newsletter the next weekend, episode the next, so on and so forth. The newsletters will have bios on our guests, recaps of previous episodes, little teasers for future episodes. They'll also include the Farms and Frontlines book club, which is really just books that we've enjoyed reading about just different topics on food or food security and all that good stuff. So plenty of great information in there. It's a great resource. We'll have links to sign up for it on our socials as well as in the episode descriptions. Thank you again to everybody for listening. Truly means the world to us. If you haven't yet, go ahead and rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time.